Dun, 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 dun. So here's our second game for the channel, the War of Turkish Liberation, 1920 and 1922. This is another decision games, game made for Strategy and Tactics magazine. They don't actually have the best track record, but they do have a few good ones in here, and here's one that I think is a pretty good one, like the last one I did, the Italian-Ottoman War. Although this is a very different game system. This is more conventional and is a hex encounter war game, and it's simulating on a much larger scale. So we're not seeing the kind of crazy rapid movements across like the deserts and stuff, and the Libyan plain, coastal plain that is. We're just seeing a more grand scale war in this region. And so the war it's covering, as the name implies, War of Turkish Liberation. So a little bit of historical background as I get into the setup and how the game works. The World War I ends, for the Ottoman Empire, it ends with the Treaty of, I'm probably going to mispronounce this city name, but I think it's Severus? Anyway, it divides the Ottoman Empire into multiple different countries / protectorates, colonial parts of European powers, like Syria was given to the French, for example. The Palestinian Mandate was under the British rule. Iraq was like a separate country that was kind of under British protection. It gets divided up into this. One of these things is the Greek zone, was an area for Greek occupation around Smyrna, and the cities on the coast that had an ancient Ionian Greek population and a large minority there. Constantinople and the surrounding cities around the straits here between the Black Sea and the Aegean. It was an international zone under, it has French, has a lot of predominantly British, and then a little bit of Italian units as well. But there was a formal Italian occupation zone, a French occupation zone, and there was more outside of the game map. But this map with Turkey is what matters. Up here we have Thrace, which is Greek, and up near Edirne, that's a misprint. It's supposed to be Edirne, which used to be Adrianople back in the Roman days. This is Turkish territory, Ottoman territory. Technically, it's not actually Turkey yet. This is the war that will transform it into Turkey. And then over here we have the Caucasian republics: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Obviously, Turkish forces here with Ataturk himself, although at this time he's still Mustafa Kemal. And then up here we have Bolshevik forces. In the game, Bolsheviks and the Turks are on the same side. They're called the revolutionary faction. Every other country is considered the imperialist faction, although the major European powers are not actually involved unless they are attacked directly. Otherwise, it's just pretty much just the Greeks operating here. Although, because this game has some interesting ways for possible ahistorical things, it is possible that the Russian White Army under Wrangel, which at this time is in the Crimea fighting, up past the map, fighting the Bolsheviks, they at one point were transported through the straits when they were basically, the war was lost there and they got out of the country. And there was very brief and not particularly serious, but still some talks among the European powers about using the White Army to fight the Turks. It didn't happen, obviously, in real life. The game gives a very slight chance that it will, so that could potentially drastically change how the war goes, so we'll see if something like that might happen. Otherwise, we have the Turkish forces fighting the Greek forces in the west, and the Turkish forces fighting the Armenian forces in the east. And then also in the east, the Bolsheviks are fighting the Georgians, the Azerbaijanis, and the Armenians all at once. So they're trying to cut through, retake the Caucasus republics back into the fold. Obviously, the Turks want to crush Armenia, one, because Armenia was given a substantial amount of national territory by the treaty, and the Turks wanted to push them all back. And then the, what was I saying? Actually, did I do an error here? Let me check something. I need to check something on the setup. Just realized that I misread something here. Place all, says start Turkish national units within 2 seconds at least one siege. No, as room. No, I didn't. I started thinking about, like, I think, because I know that the Armenians were given a lot of national territory, but now I think about when the game actually starts, I think it's the Turks have already pushed up into Armenia at the start. But for a second I thought it was because I could see the national boundary here, and I'm like, wait a minute, did I do something wrong? And they're supposed to be more up here, but no, it's actually fine. Anyway, the Turkish capital, although it's not marked particularly special on here, but it's Ankara, as it is in real life right now. The way the war worked, or how it kind of started, was after the Sultan accepted the treaty, pretty much capitulated entirely, and basically told Turks to stand down. Mustafa Kemal had gathered up a lot of other like-minded nationalist officers and aristocrats, members of high society, etc. They would go on to form the Grand National Assembly, which is a thing that happens in this game, although it's not at the start, but it can be formed. And then you get a special mechanic here, which will kind of change how the Turks work a little bit in parts of the game, depending on their prestige, which is changed by how well the war is going. But they formed that in Ankara, pretty much unilaterally overthrew the Sultan and declared the Republic of Turkey. And that would... it was kind of, although before they were like really pushing for it when it was still being gathered, the European powers actually knew about it, but didn't think it was much of a threat, and they dramatically underestimated how the power of Turkish nationalism at the time. They thought they were basically still dealing with a defeated foe, didn't realize how much the Turks would kind of be reinvigorated by the severing off of these chunks of their territory would really piss a lot of people off, especially the Greek part, as the Greeks were pushing for more territory, and there was a whole back and forth, and it looked like the Sultan was going to cave for everything, so it became a major issue here, it rallying a nationalist army, which would be commanded by a cadre of veterans of the First World War, put together by Mustafa Kemal, himself a veteran of the First World War, and actually, as we saw in my other playthrough, of the Italian Ottoman War as well. That was kind of where his career started to rise, and then he became famous at Gallipoli. I'm not ordering you to attack, I'm ordering you to die, is a pretty famous quote from when he was fighting the Australians and ordered a counterattack that looked hopeless, but actually ended up being successful and helped push the Australians back off of some heights and kept them to think. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all that right now. The important thing is that's kind of, that's how the basis for how the war sort of starts. So the strategic situation here, and the way I kind of set it up, is pretty historical for the most part, not necessarily in the specific divisions, but kind of the objectives for each side. The Greeks don't really have a lot of leeway. They're pretty much always doing the same thing. Same for the Armenian stuff. It's the strategic, how exactly you want to approach the war is pretty much in the hands of the imperialist player, so the Turkey and the Turkish, really. The Bolsheviks are going to do the same thing they always do, basically. There's not really much strategic leeway there, except maybe a little bit on exactly how they want to go for it, but not much there. So in this case, the Turks are going to be playing defense on the west, because the Greeks have a lot of strong forces available, and they have a lot of forces they can build, and they got a pretty good chunk of resources to push forward. Thrace will probably fall fairly quickly, and there's a high chance that the Edirne garrison will just surrender anyway. It's not a great show for them. But if they do decide to actually fight, that could help quite a bit. We'll see. That's a slight random chance. Historically, they surrendered. And then we have a good chunk of supply convoys, which are mechanic, and I'll explain how those work when we get into the first turn. But they're used for supporting and attacks or defensive for combat, and then can be expended for emergency supply to reinforce damaged units. Like, so if a infantry unit here has been damaged, you could expend a supply convoy and build them back up during the right phase. Anyway, We have infantry divisions, cavalry, and then we have these irregular units, which are these kind of thing, which have special mechanics, which I'll go into in a second. I'll explain it more on our Armenian side because it'll make a little more sense. You'll see why. Cities, obviously, terrain. There's no zones of control in this game. It's all just about like controlling the individual hexes. There's nothing to stop people from just, so if this was open, from just sweeping through. So you've got to kind of try to maintain a sort of front line, but it's tricky with how it goes. So you can end up with some weird situations. The Armenians here, and the Turks by extension, the Armenians are trying to just hold on to their country. And the Turks here are going to be on the offensive in the east and trying to break Armenia as fast as they can so that they can bring those strong forces. I put their strongest units here. They can bring strongest attacking units, I should say, that they start with. So they can bring those strong units back across to the west to counterattack the Greeks, who were probably almost inevitably going to be pushing pretty far forward. Historically, they basically made it to approximately this line. Even a little bit farther in like kind of a bulge. And then the Turks were able to counterattack and push them back. So we'll see how it goes there. Georgia will be the Bolsheviks pretty much are going to fight for Georgia, fight for Armenia, fight for Azerbaijan. Not a lot of thinking to do, more of a tactical thinking of how exactly do I want to approach these attacks rather than, any kind of deeper strategic things. The Georgia or Azerbaijan, Armenia, they can't intermingle with each other. They can't enter national territory, anything like that. Turkey's only at war with Armenia, not Georgia or Azerbaijan. But replacement points for each of these factions, because they're all still under the imperialist player, can be spent on some interesting things, namely subverting irregular units. So these irregular units that we have here, so some of them, if you look at, say, this Georgian guy, he's just blank. So if he is subverted, that is, if you spend a replacement point, in this case it would be the Turkish/Bolshevik player, they spend a replacement point, instead of buying a unit or a supply convoy or reinforcing a unit, they could roll a dice to try to subvert this irregular unit. So on a roll of a 1, or actually I'll start at the top. On the roll of a 6, nothing happens, the unit stays. On a roll of a 2 to 5, the unit is destroyed. It's just gone. Irregulars were bribed to leave. On a roll of a 1, though, on a roll of a 1 to 5 for the Georgian unit, it would be destroyed. But on a roll of a 1 for a Turkish irregular or an Armenian irregular, they are instead subverted to the opposing side. So if it's subverted, and it was stacked with another unit, it would immediately be moved to an open space that's the nearest open space that's adjacent, or or an adjacent open space, or the nearest one after that. Basically, just move somewhere. And you can see on the Turkish irregulars, same thing, and then they get moved somewhere if they need to be. So that's pretty bad. It's a pretty high chance that you'll just lose the unit outright. And if you're Armenia or Turkey, you might even be subverted to the enemy side. So it's like, okay, why even bother? What's the point of having those units at all? Well, that would be the irregular retreat before combat table. So what this does is basically, if an irregular unit or an irregular unit stack is being attacked, so let's say the Bolsheviks, say you just threw all these units at these irregular Georgian units, all of them here. Oops. There would be a die roll, and if the Georgian unit was successful in this die roll, and there are modifiers, we'll go into that in the actual turn, but if the Georgian unit is successful on die roll, they quote-unquote melt into the countryside, and the attempted attack has to be aborted because the Bolsheviks can't find them. Georgians are just gone. And they pull back, and the Georgian irregular unit just doesn't engage in combat. It just gets to stay in the hex. So it just completely negates the attempted attack, which is incredibly useful for slowing down your opponent, which is very important in this game for both sides at different areas. So that's pretty cool. They're potentially one of the best defending units possible. They just have that serious drawback as well. But when they're there, it's a big deal. They're not particularly valuable as a combat unit. you know, even the best ones are only 1-1s. It's one attack strength, 1 defense strength, and then the 4 is the movement. So that's how it goes: attack, defense, movement. So it's not particularly great. And this combat results table there's a lot of both sides taking losses here, and that's going to be a problem. It's partially a war of attrition, and you're going to need to be feeding your replacement points to be building up units, building them back, etc. The way the turn sequence goes, sequence of play, administrative segment, it's just denoting that. I don't even know why they even bothered putting it there. We go right to the random events phase. There's a cup of random events. So I'll pull an event chit, and then I'll have to consult the book here. Here's a list of the events. That's it. Oops, that's it. Let's run into somewhere. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So there's A events, the first ones, and these are their effects when they're pulled. They have different things. The Caliphate Army, so the Sullivan Sultan can try to form a military force. There's different rebellions. The Grand National Assembly, which I kind of talked about a little bit. Evacuation of the whites, kind of talked about that. So there's different things here that have bonuses or nothing for each side. Or just you can get a no event that does nothing. And then turn 7, there's B events, so then more stuff comes in after that. And then the game is won by victory points, which are determined through different control over cities and areas and units destroyed and things like that. So the Turks can choose to violate the international zones, fight these units, and if fight like the Italians or the French, and if they take those cities and force or destroy the units and force the withdrawal of one of the foreign powers, they get victory points for the end of the game. So a lot going on of weird ways to kind of, not weird, but for interesting ways to kind of accrue victory points and get that done. And then we go, yes, you get the points, which these can be modified by the random events as well. Then placement, place all the stuff. Operations is the operations segment is this phase. I hate that they even have the segments on there. So then we do Imperialists move and fight first. The Imperialists would activate one power first, one country, so say Greece. They move, and then that's they do combat, and that's it, they're done. Then they move on to the next one, and so forth. The revolutionaries, Turkey always moves first, then the Bolsheviks, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty straightforward, and we got our terrain stuff, and I think we can see the end of it. So that should be pretty cool. See you on the first turn.